There's one thing about narcissists that people often understand far too late, and it explains why so many relationships with them become confusing, exhausting, and almost impossible to make sense of from the inside. The mistake is assuming that if you explain your pain clearly enough, show enough patience, love them deeply enough, or finally find the perfect words, they will eventually understand what they're doing to you and change. But understanding the difference between what someone hears and what they're capable of emotionally processing can completely change the way you see the entire dynamic. Let's start with the most important thing I wish people understood about narcissists. Their behavior isn't always going to make sense if you evaluate it through the psychology of a healthy relationship. A healthy person generally wants their actions and their relationships to make sense together. If they hurt someone they genuinely care about, the discomfort of that contradiction can motivate reflection. They may ask what they did, why they did it, how it affected the other person, and what they need to do differently. They may feel uncomfortable admitting they were wrong, but the relationship itself can become more important than protecting their self-image. This is where narcissistic dynamics can become profoundly confusing. You may approach the conversation expecting two people to be solving the same problem. You're trying to repair the relationship. They're trying to protect their version of themselves. And those are completely different objectives. You may say, "You hurt me." What you mean is, "I want you to understand what happened so we can prevent it from happening again." But they may hear something entirely different. They may hear criticism, exposure, rejection, an accusation that threatens the version of themselves they desperately need to maintain. And once that happens, the conversation can stop being about the original behavior altogether. Suddenly, you're defending why you're upset. You're explaining why your reaction is reasonable. You're answering accusations you never made. You're being told you're too sensitive. You're being reminded of something you did months ago. You're suddenly discussing your tone instead of their behavior. And eventually, you find yourself thinking, how did we get here? That's one of the things I wish people understood. The conversation can be deliberately or automatically redirected away from accountability and toward your reaction. And once you recognize that pattern, something becomes much clearer. You don't have to win every argument to know what happened. You don't need someone else to agree with your perception before your experience becomes valid. You don't need the narcissist to confirm that they hurt you before you are allowed to take the hurt seriously. This is especially important because people in these relationships often become obsessed with finding the perfect explanation. They think, maybe I said it wrong. Maybe I should have waited. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I need to explain the situation from their perspective. Maybe if they understood how much I love them, they wouldn't behave this way. And this is where years can disappear, because you're trying to solve a problem of capacity with better communication. Communication matters enormously in healthy relationships, but communication cannot compensate indefinitely for a lack of willingness to listen, reflect, and take responsibility. You can communicate perfectly and still be misunderstood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You can explain your boundary calmly and still have it challenged. You can provide evidence and still be told you're imagining things. You can remain patient and still be accused of being cruel the moment you stop accommodating. And that doesn't necessarily mean you failed to communicate. Sometimes it means the conversation was never taking place on equal psychological ground. Here's another thing I wish people understood. Narcissistic behavior isn't always loud. People often imagine the narcissist as someone constantly shouting, insulting, or openly dominating everyone around them. But manipulation can be quiet. It can look like withdrawal. It can look like selective affection. It can look like giving you warmth when you comply and distance when you don't. It can look like making you feel guilty for having ordinary needs. It can look like subtle comparisons. It can look like changing the subject whenever accountability appears. It can look like acting wounded whenever you express hurt. And because none of these behaviors necessarily look dramatic from the outside, the person experiencing them can begin doubting themselves. They think, maybe I'm making this bigger than it is. But the impact of a pattern doesn't disappear simply because each individual incident looks small. One dismissive comment may be nothing. One forgotten promise may be nothing. One defensive reaction may be nothing. But when the same behavior repeats every time you express a need, the pattern becomes the information, and patterns matter more than isolated moments. This is another reason why people become trapped trying to analyze individual conversations. They replay one argument, one message, one sentence, one expression, one night. But the more useful question is often much broader. What happens repeatedly? What happens when you disagree? What happens when you say no? What happens when you need support? What happens when they make a mistake? What happens when you stop giving them what they want? What happens when you become less emotionally reactive? Those moments reveal far more than the charming version of someone you met at the beginning. Because almost anyone can behave beautifully when everything is going their way. And once you stop making it your responsibility to fix the narcissist, another reality becomes much easier to see. You were never supposed to carry the entire emotional weight of the relationship by yourself. A relationship requires two people willing to examine themselves, two people willing to listen, two people willing to repair damage, and two people willing to change behavior when something is repeatedly hurting the connection. When only one person is doing that work, the relationship may continue physically, but emotionally it becomes a one-person project. This is where many people lose themselves. They become so focused on keeping the relationship alive that they stop asking whether the relationship is actually capable of giving life back to them. You can spend years becoming more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, more careful with your words, more aware of triggers, more conscious of their emotions, and more willing to compromise, while the other person becomes increasingly comfortable receiving all of that effort without developing the same responsibility. And because your efforts occasionally produce a peaceful period, you may convince yourself that the strategy is working. But temporary peace isn't necessarily evidence of permanent change. Sometimes it's simply the calm between two repetitions of the same pattern. This is why consistency matters so much. Anyone can behave differently for a few days after a major conflict. Anyone can promise that things will change when they're afraid of losing something. Anyone can become affectionate when they sense you pulling away. The real question is what happens after the crisis disappears. Does the new behavior remain when there is nothing to gain from performing it? Does accountability remain when nobody is threatening to leave? Does respect remain when disagreement returns? Does empathy remain when your needs become inconvenient? Those moments tell you much more than dramatic promises ever could. And this is where one of the most painful lessons begins to emerge. Sometimes the relationship improves only when you are about to leave. That can create a powerful illusion that the person has finally understood. Suddenly they're affectionate again. Suddenly they're apologizing. Suddenly they're remembering everything you told them. Suddenly they are promising a completely different future. And because you've been starving for recognition, even a small amount can feel enormous. You think, finally, they understand. But understanding demonstrated only during the threat of losing access to you is not the same thing as consistent accountability. The difference becomes visible over time. If the behavior changes only when consequences are immediate, the relationship hasn't necessarily changed. The strategy may simply have changed. This is why you should pay attention to what happens after you relax again. Do they maintain the behavior when they feel secure? Or do the old patterns slowly return once they believe the relationship is safe again? That cycle can continue for years because every crisis creates another temporary improvement, and every improvement restores enough hope to keep you invested. Eventually, you can become addicted, not to the person themselves, but to the relief that follows the crisis. The argument ends. They become affectionate. You feel close again. The tension disappears. For a moment, everything feels beautiful. And that emotional contrast can make the relationship feel more intense than it actually is. The highs feel extraordinary because the lows were so painful. This is why intermittent reinforcement can be so powerful in unhealthy relationships. You don't receive the reward consistently. You receive it unpredictably. And unpredictable rewards can create stronger attachment than predictable ones because your mind keeps waiting for the next moment of relief. Maybe this time they'll be loving again. Maybe this time the apology will be real. Maybe this time we'll finally get back to how things were. But eventually, you have to recognize the difference between reconciliation and repair. Reconciliation means the conflict has ended. Repair means something has actually changed. Reconciliation can happen in an evening. Repair requires consistent behavior over time. Reconciliation can involve tears, affection, promises, and emotional conversations. Repair involves accountability, boundaries, changed behavior, and sustained effort. And if the same injury keeps happening after every reconciliation, then reconciliation isn't solving the problem. It's simply resetting the cycle. This is another thing I wish people understood about narcissistic dynamics. You cannot measure the health of the relationship by how intensely someone reacts when they fear losing you. Measure it by how they behave when they know they have you. That's where character becomes visible. When you stop chasing, what happens? When you stop explaining, what happens? When you stop giving unlimited reassurance, what happens? When you say no, what happens? When you prioritize yourself, what happens? These moments often reveal whether you're dealing with genuine connection or conditional attachment. Someone who genuinely values you may be disappointed by your boundary, but they can still respect it. Someone who primarily values access to you may experience your boundary as an attack. And that's a distinction worth remembering. A boundary isn't an insult. A boundary is information about what you will participate in. You don't need someone else's permission to have one. You don't need them to agree with it. And you don't need to convince them that it's reasonable before acting on it. And that is where the deepest lesson finally becomes clear. The more you understand yourself, the less obsessed you become with understanding the narcissist. Not because you stop caring about psychology, but because you stop believing that their psychology is the missing piece that will finally make your life make sense. You realize that knowing exactly why someone lies doesn't make the lie less painful. Knowing exactly why someone manipulates doesn't make manipulation acceptable. Knowing where their insecurity comes from doesn't obligate you to absorb the consequences of it. Understanding can give you context, but it doesn't have to become permission. This is something I wish people understood much earlier. You are allowed to make decisions based on behavior without fully understanding motivation. If someone repeatedly hurts you, you don't need to know whether they did it because of insecurity, entitlement, fear, resentment, jealousy, or some combination of all of them. You only need to recognize that the behavior is happening. That realization can save an enormous amount of emotional energy, because one of the easiest ways to remain psychologically attached to a narcissistic relationship is to turn the person into a mystery that you must solve. You analyze their childhood. You analyze their messages. You analyze their tone. You analyze their silence. You analyze their social media activity. You analyze their new relationships. You analyze whether they miss you. You analyze whether they know they hurt you. You analyze whether they are capable of love. And eventually, your entire mental world revolves around someone you may no longer even want in your physical life. That's the paradox. You can leave someone physically while continuing to live psychologically inside the relationship. And sometimes that is even harder to recognize because it feels like healing. You're not contacting them. You're not arguing, you're not going back, but you're still checking, you're still wondering, you're still imagining conversations, you're still waiting for an apology, you're still hoping they'll finally understand, you're still imagining what you would say if they came back. And that means part of you is still waiting for the relationship to produce an ending it may never provide. Real closure often begins when you stop requiring the other person to participate in your healing. That doesn't mean their behavior didn't matter. It means their future behavior doesn't get to determine your future. Maybe they apologize, maybe they don't. Maybe they regret it, maybe they don't. Maybe they understand one day, maybe they never do. Your healing cannot remain suspended between those possibilities. You have to build a life that works regardless of which one becomes true. And this is where self-trust becomes more important than their validation. Think about how much energy can be spent trying to get someone else to confirm your reality. You know what you did. Why won't you admit it? Why can't you just acknowledge what happened? Why are you acting like I'm the problem? Those questions are understandable. But if the person has repeatedly demonstrated that they will not provide the acknowledgement you're looking for, continuing to demand it may only keep you connected to the very dynamic you're trying to escape. Sometimes the most powerful sentence isn't something you say to them. It's something you finally say to yourself. I know what happened. That's enough. You don't need them to sign the document. You don't need them to approve your memory. You don't need them to agree with your interpretation. Your experience doesn't become real because someone else validates it. And this is especially important for people who have been repeatedly told that they're too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic, too demanding, or impossible to please. Over time, those messages can become internalized. You start questioning normal needs. You start apologizing for asking for respect. You start feeling guilty for wanting consistency. You start thinking boundaries are selfish. You start believing that having expectations makes you difficult, and then the healing process becomes an act of re-education. You learn that wanting honesty isn't excessive. Wanting respect isn't excessive. Wanting accountability isn't excessive. Wanting emotional safety isn't excessive. Wanting your no to be respected isn't excessive. These are basic foundations of healthy relationships. And if someone repeatedly makes you feel guilty for having them, that doesn't automatically mean your standards are too high. It may mean you've been negotiating against yourself for too long. This is another thing I wish people understood about narcissists. The relationship can train you to accept less than you would ever recommend to someone you love. You may give advice to your friend that you refuse to follow yourself. You may look at someone else's relationship and immediately recognize the manipulation. But when it's your relationship, hope and attachment complicate everything. That's why distance can create clarity. Sometimes you don't need another conversation. You need enough space to hear your own thoughts again. Enough space to notice how your body feels without constant emotional pressure. Enough space to remember who you were before every decision revolved around someone else's reaction. And as that space grows, something surprising can happen. You may begin missing the person less and missing yourself more. You may realize that what you wanted wasn't necessarily them. You wanted the version of yourself who felt hopeful, loved, understood, and emotionally connected. You wanted the future you imagined. You wanted the relationship you thought you were building. And grieving that doesn't mean you made a mistake by loving. It means something mattered to you. You can honor what mattered without returning to what harmed you. This is where people sometimes become unnecessarily harsh with themselves. They say, "How could I have been so stupid? Why did I stay so long? Why didn't I see it earlier? Why did I believe them?" But self-judgment doesn't restore the time. Self-understanding can. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me that I stayed?" ask, "What did I believe that made staying feel necessary?" Maybe you believed love could change them. Maybe you believed patience would eventually be rewarded. Maybe you were afraid of being alone. Maybe you were trying to keep your family together. Maybe you didn't trust your own perception yet. Maybe you had never experienced a relationship like this before. Understanding those reasons doesn't mean you approve of what happened. It means you become less vulnerable to repeating it. Because the purpose of healing isn't to become someone who never gets hurt again. That's impossible. The purpose is to become someone who listens sooner, someone who recognizes patterns earlier, someone who doesn't abandon their own perceptions simply because another person disagrees, someone who doesn't interpret inconsistency as a challenge to love harder, someone who understands that compassion and boundaries can exist together. And perhaps the most important shift is this. You stop asking how to make the narcissist treat you better. You start asking what you will do if they don't. That is a completely different question. The first question puts your future in their hands. The second puts your future back in yours. If they lie, what will you do? If they disrespect you, what will you do? If they violate the boundary again, what will you do? If they refuse accountability, what will you do? If they become loving only when you're leaving, what will you do? Your power doesn't come from controlling their answers. It comes from knowing your own. And this is where internal boundaries become more powerful than endless explanations. You don't have to convince someone that their behavior is unacceptable before deciding that you won't participate in it. You don't have to win an argument before ending it. You don't have to prove that someone is manipulating you before stepping away from the manipulation. You don't have to wait for them to understand your boundary before enforcing it. You can simply act according to what you've decided. And the more consistently you do that, the more your nervous system begins learning something it may have forgotten. I can protect myself. That sentence changes a person, because once you trust yourself to protect yourself, you become less desperate for someone else to protect you. You stop tolerating disrespect simply because you're afraid of losing connection. You stop accepting crumbs because you're afraid there won't be another meal. You stop believing that being chosen by someone else is more important than choosing yourself. And that's when the narcissistic dynamic begins losing its deepest source of power. Not because you've learned the perfect psychological trick, not because you've discovered the one sentence that will finally defeat them, not because you've made them jealous, not because you've convinced them that you're valuable, but because their reaction no longer determines your self-worth. That's the freedom people often misunderstand. Freedom isn't making the narcissist regret losing you. Freedom is no longer needing them to regret it. Freedom isn't making them admit they were wrong. Freedom is knowing you don't need their admission to move forward. Freedom isn't proving that you were the better partner. Freedom is no longer competing for that title. Freedom is becoming emotionally independent from the outcome of their story. And once you reach that place, something changes in how you see the entire relationship. You stop romanticizing the potential. You stop obsessing over the explanation. You stop waiting for the apology. You stop monitoring their behavior. You stop wondering whether they're thinking about you. And you start thinking about yourself again. Your goals, your health, your friendships, your work, your creativity, your future, your peace, your identity. The life that existed before the relationship becomes visible again. And perhaps that is the final thing I wish people understood. The biggest victory isn't understanding the narcissist perfectly. It's understanding yourself well enough that you no longer need to. You don't need to know every reason behind their behavior. You need to know what behavior you accept. You don't need to predict their next move. You need to know your next move. You don't need to understand their entire psychology. You need to understand your own limits. You don't need to convince them of your worth. You need to stop negotiating it. And you don't need to spend the rest of your life asking why they treated you the way they did. At some point, the better question becomes, now that I know, what kind of life am I going to build? That question turns your attention away from the person who consumed so much of it and back toward the person who has been waiting for you all along. You. And maybe that's the understanding people need most. A narcissist doesn't have to understand your value for you to have value. They don't have to admit they hurt you for your pain to matter. They don't have to regret losing you for your absence to be meaningful. And they don't have to change for you to change your life. Because your healing begins the moment you stop making your future dependent on someone else's capacity to finally understand what they did to you.